Margaret Williams froze mid-step on her porch, coffee mug slipping from arthritic fingers to shatter on weathered wood. The massive black bear dragging a canvas bag across her Montana property wasn't foraging. It was delivering something. What emerged from that torn military duffel wasn't garbage or stolen camping gear. It was a bear cub, barely breathing, wearing a leather collar that gleamed against matted fur. Margaret's knees buckled. Her neighbor's death 3 months ago flashed through her mind. The Hendersons, found in their car accident with no skid marks on dry pavement. The mother bear dropped her burden with deliberate care, stepped back, and fixed Margaret with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to plead. "Sweet Jesus," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking like autumn leaves. Her heart hammered against ribs that suddenly felt too fragile to contain such terror and wonder. The cub stirred weakly. The mother bear backed into pine shadows and vanished. Who sends a message through a wild animal? And what had Margaret just become a witness to? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Elizabeth Williams had lived in this same log cabin for 43 years, through blizzards that buried the porch rails and summers so dry the well ran low. At 68, she knew every creak of the floorboards, every whistle the wind made through the eaves. What she didn't know anymore was why she bothered getting up each morning. 5 years had passed since Tom's heart attack took him on a Tuesday morning while he fixed the kitchen faucet. 5 years of setting 2 plates for breakfast, then quietly putting one back in the cupboard. 5 years of talking to his photograph propped beside the coffee maker, telling him about the weather, the bills, the phone calls from their children that came less and less frequently. Sarah lived in Seattle now, building a marketing career that left little time for a lonely mother in Montana. Michael had settled in Denver with his wife and twin boys Margaret barely knew. Both kept suggesting she sell the cabin, move somewhere more appropriate for a woman your age. Somewhere with nurse call buttons and medication reminders and other old people waiting to die. The medical bills from Tom's final months had eaten through most of their savings. Property taxes climbed higher each year, while her teacher's pension stayed the same. Some nights, Margaret lay awake calculating how many more years she could afford to stay in the home where she'd raised her children, where Tom had carried her over the threshold as a young bride. She'd been the kind of elementary school teacher children remembered decades later, the one who kept pet hamsters in the classroom and knew every student's birthday. 40 years of shaping young minds, and now she felt invisible, useless as yesterday's newspaper. Her doctor prescribed pills for the anxiety that crept up her throat like smoke, but they only made her feel disconnected from the few things that still mattered. Margaret fed the local wildlife despite park regulations, scattering seeds for the birds and leaving apple cores where deer might find them. It gave her something to nurture when her own family seemed beyond reach. She'd noticed strange men in expensive cars driving slowly past her property lately, city types with binoculars who didn't look like tourists. The Henderson family down the mountain had died in what everyone called a car accident 3 months ago, though Margaret couldn't shake the feeling something wasn't right about that story. "I've lived through enough winters to know when trouble's brewing," she told Tom's photograph that morning, the same way she'd told him about everything for 48 years of marriage. "Remember what you always said about trusting my gut? Well, it's been talking lately." She kept his flannel shirts in the closet because they still smelled like sawdust and aftershave. She slept in the guest room because their bed felt too empty. She maintained the house with obsessive care because it was the only thing left in her control. Most days, Margaret Williams felt like she was just waiting for permission to stop trying. The coffee mug lay in pieces at Margaret's feet, dark liquid seeping between the porch boards where Tom had spent countless evenings watching the sunset. Her bare feet felt the September chill, but she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. couldn't process what she was witnessing at 5:47 on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other in 5 years of sameness. The black bear was massive, easily 400 pounds, her dark fur scarred along the shoulders from battles Margaret could only imagine. This wasn't the curious, clumsy foraging behavior Margaret had observed from her kitchen window over the years. This was something else entirely, purposeful, deliberate, almost human in its intention. The bear's powerful jaws gripped the end of a military-style canvas bag, the kind Tom had used during his Army Reserves days, now torn and stained with something Margaret hoped wasn't blood. Every instinct screamed at Margaret to retreat into the cabin, slam the door, and reach for Tom's shotgun on the mantel. Black bears weren't typically aggressive toward humans, but a mother protecting cubs could be deadly, and this one's behavior was unlike anything Margaret had seen in her decades of mountain living. Yet something held her frozen on the porch. Not fear, but a strange recognition in the bear's dark eyes when they met hers across 30 feet of morning shadows. The bear dragged the bag with effort, grunting occasionally, pausing to rest her massive frame against the strain. Margaret's teacher instincts kicked in, the same observation skills that had helped her identify troubled children over 40 years in the classroom. This bear was exhausted, not from the physical effort but from something deeper, a bone-deep weariness that Margaret recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror every morning since Tom died. When the bear stopped just beyond the porch steps, Margaret's breath caught in her throat like a fish hook. The animal's ears swiveled constantly, listening for threats, but her eyes remained fixed on Margaret with an intelligence that seemed impossible. Bears were smart creatures, Margaret knew, but this one's gaze held something that made her think of the mothers who'd come to her classroom over the years, desperate women seeking help for children they couldn't save alone. The bag moved, not from gravity or the bear's shifting position, but from something alive inside, something struggling weakly against the canvas confines. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that might startle the bear into attack mode. The movement came again, accompanied by the faintest whimper, a sound so soft Margaret wasn't sure she'd heard it over her thundering heartbeat. The bear took 2 deliberate steps backward, never breaking eye contact, and sat on her haunches like a trained dog waiting for a command. The gesture was so unnatural, so contrary to wild behavior, that Margaret felt reality shifting beneath her feet like loose gravel. This wasn't a random encounter or a bear seeking food. This was a delivery. Margaret's nursing instincts, dormant since she'd helped Tom through his final illness, stirred to life. Whatever was in that bag needed help, and for reasons she couldn't fathom, this bear had brought it to her doorstep. The animal's scarred muzzle and the careful way she'd positioned the bag spoke of intelligence and desperation combined, a combination Margaret understood better than she cared to admit. The September morning air carried the scent of pine sap and something else, fear, wild and sharp. Margaret took one tentative step forward, her bare feet silent on the wooden planks. The bear didn't move, didn't growl, didn't show any of the warning signs Tom had taught her to watch for during their hiking days. Instead, she tilted her great head slightly, as if encouraging Margaret to approach. "Easy, Mama," Margaret whispered, the same tone she'd used with frightened children on their first day of school. "I'm not going to hurt anyone." The bag rustled again, more urgently this time, and Margaret saw a small paw push against the torn canvas. Her heart clenched with recognition and terror. A bear cub, too young to survive alone, too weak to escape whatever tragedy had separated it from its mother. But this bear wasn't the mother, Margaret realized with growing clarity. This bear was a messenger. Margaret knelt slowly beside the bag, her arthritic knees protesting against the rough porch boards. The zipper had been torn partially open by claws or teeth, revealing glimpses of dark fur and one tiny, frightened eye. When she looked up, the mother bear had vanished into the pine shadows as silently as smoke, leaving only paw prints in the damp earth and a responsibility Margaret hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. Inside the bag, something small and broken waited for salvation, and Margaret Williams, invisible, useless, forgotten Margaret, was apparently the only hope it had left. Margaret's hands trembled as she carefully widened the torn opening of the canvas bag, her movements deliberate and gentle despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Inside lay a black bear cub, perhaps 4 or 5 months old, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths, dark fur matted with dirt, and something that looked suspiciously like dried blood, eyes half closed with exhaustion that spoke of trauma beyond his young comprehension. "Oh, sweet baby," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking like ice on a spring morning. The cub's ears twitched at her voice, but he didn't lift his head, too weak or too frightened to acknowledge her presence. Margaret had seen this same exhaustion in her classroom, children who'd endured too much, who'd learned that safety was a luxury they couldn't afford to believe in. The cub was severely dehydrated, his tiny nose dry and cracked, his breathing too quick and shallow. Margaret's limited first aid knowledge, gained from decades of playground injuries and Tom's final illness, told her this little one was in serious trouble. But as she reached to lift him from the bag, her fingers encountered something unexpected. A leather collar hidden beneath the thick fur around his neck, worn smooth and obviously crafted by human hands. Margaret's blood ran cold. Wild bear cubs didn't wear collars. This little one had been someone's pet, someone's illegal captive, and now he was here on her doorstep like a desperate plea for help. She thought of the Henderson family's tragic accident 3 months ago, of the strange men in expensive cars who'd been circling the area lately, and felt pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to align in ways that made her stomach clench with dread. She lifted the cub carefully, surprised by how light he felt in her arms, too light for a healthy bear his age. His tiny body felt fragile as spun glass, and Margaret found herself cradling him against her chest, the same way she'd held her own children during their worst fevers. The cub made no protest, didn't struggle or try to bite, behavior so contrary to wild animal instincts that Margaret's unease deepened into genuine fear. "What happened to you, little one?" she murmured, carrying him into the warmth of her cabin. "And why did she bring you to me?" Margaret settled the cub on Tom's old Afghan beside the fireplace, her movements automatic as she fell into the caregiving routines that had defined her adult life. She warmed milk on the stove, diluting it with water the way she remembered doing for orphaned kittens decades ago. The cub's eyes followed her movements with an alertness that seemed wrong for such a young animal, too knowing, too wary, as if he'd learned lessons no baby should have to learn. When Margaret offered the bottle, the cub initially turned away, but hunger eventually overcame caution. His tiny paws gripped the bottle with surprising dexterity, and Margaret noticed faint scars on his paw pads, evidence of captivity, of pacing on concrete or wire mesh instead of soft forest floors. Her heart ached with a pain she hadn't felt since watching Tom struggle for breath in those final hospital days. "Someone hurt you," Margaret said softly, stroking the cub's head with gentle fingers. "Someone who should have protected you instead." As if understanding her words, the cub made a small sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a growl, but something heartbreakingly human in its need for comfort. Margaret felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally spill over, dripping onto the cub's dark fur as she whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The collar bothered her more with each passing minute. Margaret examined it carefully, finding a small zippered compartment she hadn't noticed before, waterproof and designed to hold something precious. Inside, Her fingers found 4 color photographs, their edges worn soft with handling. Her breath caught as she recognized the location in each image. The Henderson property down the mountain, the family everyone said had died in that suspicious car accident. The photos showed a young blonde woman Margaret vaguely remembered from occasional trips to town, Emma Henderson, playing with this same bear cub in what looked like a backyard paradise. Emma Benny, 6 months, read the inscription on the back of one photo. First swim, said another, showing the woman teaching the cub to paddle in a small pond. Margaret's hands shook as the implications crashed over her like a cold mountain stream. The Hendersons hadn't died in any accident. They'd been murdered, and this cub, this sweet baby she was now calling Benny, had somehow survived whatever horror had claimed his human family. The mother bear who delivered him must have found him, protected him, brought him to the only person she somehow knew might help. "Dear God," Margaret breathed, looking down at Benny as he finished the bottle and curled against her leg with trust that made her chest tight with responsibility. "You saw it all, didn't you? You saw what happened to them." A black sedan drove slowly past her cabin at that moment, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun like dead eyes. Margaret's blood turned to ice water as she realized she'd just become something she'd never imagined in her 68 quiet years. She was harboring a witness to murder, and the killers were still out there, still hunting. Benny whimpered in his sleep, tiny paws paddling against invisible threats, and Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Whatever had happened to the Hendersons, whatever danger was circling her property like wolves, she wouldn't let them have this baby, not while she still drew breath. "I've got you now," she whispered fiercely. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The first week with Benny transformed Margaret's cabin from a mausoleum of memories into something resembling a home again. She established routines with the precision of her teaching days. Bottle feedings every 3 hours, gentle exercises to strengthen his weakened muscles, and careful monitoring of his recovery from whatever trauma had brought him to her doorstep. The cub responded with a trust that both warmed and worried her. Wild animals shouldn't bond so quickly with humans, yet Benny followed her from room to room like a devoted puppy. Margaret found herself talking to Benny constantly, the way she'd once chattered to her own children during their toddler years. "Come on, sweetheart, just a little more milk," she'd coax during feedings, and Benny would look up at her with dark eyes that held intelligence far beyond his months. He learned his name within days, responding to her voice with eager attention that made Margaret's heart swell with purpose she'd forgotten she could feel. The changes in Margaret were as dramatic as Benny's physical recovery. She stopped taking her anxiety medication, slept through the night for the first time in years, and actually looked forward to each new day. When Sarah called from Seattle, Margaret found herself laughing during their conversation, a sound so rare that her daughter commented on it immediately. "Mom, you sound different," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the miles with genuine surprise. "Happier, somehow." "What's changed?" Margaret almost told her about Benny, the words dancing on her tongue like spring water, but something held her back. Maybe it was the memory of those photographs in the collar, or the increasing frequency of unfamiliar cars on the mountain road, but instinct warned her to keep Benny's presence secret until she understood the full scope of what she'd stumbled into. "I've just been taking better care of myself," Margaret said instead, which wasn't entirely a lie. For the first time since Tom's death, she had a reason to get up each morning beyond mere habit. Benny's intelligence continued to astound her. He learned to open doors by watching her movements, brought her items when she dropped them, and seemed to understand basic commands with a comprehension that went far beyond normal animal training. One morning, Margaret found him attempting to make her bed by pulling the quilt with his teeth, a gesture so endearingly domestic that she dissolved into tears of joy and heartbreak. But as the second week began, Margaret's growing happiness was shadowed by mounting unease. Her research into the Henderson family's deaths revealed disturbing inconsistencies in the official reports. The accident had occurred on a clear day, on a straight stretch of road Emma Henderson had driven countless times. No other vehicles were involved, no mechanical failures reported, yet the car had somehow veered off the road and struck a tree at sufficient speed to kill both occupants instantly. Margaret drove to the accident site on a crisp Thursday morning, leaving Benny safely hidden in the cabin's root cellar, a precaution that felt increasingly necessary. The crash location showed no skid marks, no evidence of emergency braking or attempt to avoid collision. The damaged tree bore scars too precise, too controlled for a genuine accident. Margaret had lived through enough Montana winters to recognize deliberate violence when she saw it. Local gossip gathered during carefully casual conversations at the hardware store and post office painted a picture of the Hendersons as reclusive but decent people who'd kept to themselves in recent months. "Emma seemed nervous the last few times I saw her," confided Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store. "Like she was looking over her shoulder, you know. And there were strange men asking questions about them after the funeral." The hardware store owner, Jim Crawford, lowered his voice when Margaret casually inquired about recent visitors to the area. "City types," he said, with the mountain dwellers' instinctive distrust of outsiders. "Expensive suits, fancy cars, asking about wildlife activity up your way. Claimed to be from some government agency, but their IDs looked too new, if you know what I mean." Margaret's blood chilled as she realized the scope of the danger surrounding her and Benny. Whatever the Hendersons had been involved in, it had cost them their lives, and now she was harboring the only remaining evidence of their activities. She began taking precautions that would have seemed paranoid just weeks earlier, checking her locks obsessively, varying her routines, and keeping Tom's loaded shotgun within easy reach. The third week brought the first direct threat. A man in an expensive suit appeared at her door on a Wednesday afternoon, his credentials identifying him as Marcus Sterling from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He was clean-cut and professional, with the kind of practiced smile Margaret remembered from insurance salesmen and politicians, but his eyes were cold as winter lakes. "Mrs. Williams, I'm investigating reports of unusual wildlife activity in this area," Sterling said, his voice smooth as honey over razor blades. "Have you noticed anything out of the ordinary? Bears acting strangely, perhaps? Animals that might have been displaced by recent incidents?" Margaret forced her expression into the bemused confusion of a harmless elderly woman, a performance she'd perfected during parent-teacher conferences with difficult fathers. "Wildlife activity? Well, I see bears occasionally, but nothing unusual. Should I be concerned?" Sterling's questions grew more specific, focusing on bear cubs and recent sightings near her property. Throughout the conversation, Benny remained hidden in the root cellar, but Margaret could sense his distress through the floorboards. When Sterling finally left, the cub refused to come out for hours, cowering in the darkness until Margaret coaxed him with soft words and patient waiting. That night, someone searched through Margaret's garbage cans, rifling through weeks of refuse with the thoroughness of professionals. Margaret watched from her darkened bedroom window, her heart hammering against ribs that felt too fragile to contain such terror. The intruders moved with practiced silence, photographing items before replacing them exactly as they'd found them. Margaret began sleeping with Tom's shotgun propped against her nightstand, her teacher's instincts screaming that the situation was escalating beyond her ability to handle alone. But who could she trust? Sterling had seemed legitimate, his credentials convincing, yet Benny's reaction suggested otherwise. If government agents were involved in whatever had killed the Hendersons, then conventional authorities might be compromised. The fourth week brought revelation that changed everything. Margaret drove to the county seat, using her librarian friend's research skills to dig deeper into the Henderson case. What she discovered in old newspaper archives made her blood run cold with understanding and rage. The Hendersons had been under federal investigation for suspected involvement in illegal wildlife trafficking, specifically the capture and sale of bear cubs to private collectors and exotic animal dealers. The articles were buried in back pages, easy to miss unless someone was looking specifically, but they painted a picture of a multi-million-dollar operation spanning several states. More disturbing was the revelation that Emma Henderson had been cooperating with federal authorities as an informant, providing evidence against the larger trafficking network in exchange for immunity. Her last recorded contact with investigators was 3 days before the accident, when she'd promised to deliver final evidence that would break the case wide open. Emma Henderson was scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury next month, the final article noted. Her death has significantly complicated the ongoing investigation into one of the largest wildlife trafficking rings in U.S. history. Margaret sat in the library's quiet reading room, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a conspiracy that had already claimed 2 lives and now threatened a third. Benny wasn't just an orphaned cub. He was living proof of the Hendersons' illegal activities, and quite possibly the only witness to their murder. The trafficking ring couldn't afford to let him live, and they certainly couldn't afford to let Margaret continue protecting him. As Margaret drove home through the gathering dusk, her rearview mirror reflecting the headlights of a black sedan that had been following her since she'd left town, she realized that her quiet retirement had become a battleground. The enemy was closing in, armed with resources and ruthlessness she could barely comprehend. But they'd underestimated one crucial factor: the fierce protective instincts of a woman who'd spent 40 years defending children and who'd finally found something worth fighting for again. Margaret woke on the first Monday of her second month with Benny to find fresh tire tracks circling her cabin like a noose tightening around her neck. The impressions in the soft mountain earth told a story of methodical surveillance. Someone had spent considerable time studying her property's layout, marking escape routes, identifying vulnerabilities in ways that made her blood run cold with recognition. This wasn't casual observation. This was preparation for something final. Benny sensed the change immediately, his usual morning playfulness replaced by nervous energy that had him pacing the cabin's perimeter like a sentry. At 8 months old now, he'd grown considerably under Margaret's care, his coat glossy with health, his movements strong and confident, but the intelligence in his dark eyes held shadows of memory that no amount of love could completely erase. When the sound of approaching vehicles reached them through the pine-scented morning air, Benny bolted for the root cellar without being told, a reaction that confirmed Margaret's worst fears about what was coming. Sheriff Daniel Miller arrived first, his weathered face grim with the kind of reluctant duty that marked career law enforcement officers who'd seen too much compromise in their years of service. Behind him came Marcus Sterling and 2 men in federal windbreakers who moved with the precise coordination of professional operators. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as they spread out around her property with tactical efficiency, sealing off any chance of escape. "Margaret, we need to talk," Sheriff Miller called from her front porch, his voice carrying the weight of long friendship strained to breaking. Miller had known Tom since high school, had attended their wedding 30 years ago, had been one of the pallbearers at Tom's funeral. The pain in his eyes told Margaret everything she needed to know about the pressure being applied to force his cooperation. Sterling stepped forward with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation disguised as authority. "Mrs. Williams, we have a federal warrant to search these premises for illegal wildlife. I strongly suggest you cooperate fully to avoid additional charges." Margaret opened her door with the dignity of a woman who'd faced down 3 decades of difficult parents, hostile school boards, and bureaucratic incompetence. "I assume you have proper documentation for this intrusion on my privacy," she said, her teacher's voice carrying authority that made Sterling's jaw tighten with irritation. The warrant looked official enough to convince Sheriff Miller, who clearly wanted to believe this was a legitimate federal business rather than something darker. Margaret scanned the document with the careful attention to detail that had made her an excellent educator, noting inconsistencies in formatting and language that suggested forgery by someone skilled but not perfect. Sterling's impatience during her review only confirmed her suspicions. "We know you found something up here, Mrs. Williams," Sterling said, his professional facade slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "Wildlife tracking equipment indicates a young black bear passed through this area 2 months ago. Federal law requires you to report any contact with potentially dangerous animals." Margaret's mind raced through possible responses, weighing truth against deception, courage against prudence. In the root cellar beneath her feet, Benny waited in darkness, trusting her to protect him the way his murdered human family had failed to do. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like armor forged from love and desperation. "Gentlemen, I'm 68 years old, and I've lived on this mountain longer than some of you have been alive," Margaret said with the calm authority of someone who'd spent decades managing classrooms full of challenging children. "If I'd encountered a dangerous animal, do you really think I'd be stupid enough to handle it alone?" The search that followed was thorough and professional, the agents moving through her home with practiced efficiency while Margaret watched from her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup to hide their trembling. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Benny's food was hidden in the root cellar with him, his toys disguised as Margaret's cleaning supplies, his presence erased from every visible inch of the cabin. But Sterling's frustration grew with each empty room, his certainty that Margaret was hiding something becoming more obvious despite his attempts at professional detachment. When the search concluded without results, he fixed Margaret with a stare that promised this wasn't over, that he'd be watching and waiting for her to make a mistake. "We'll be maintaining surveillance of this area," Sterling said as his team prepared to leave. "Any attempt to conceal evidence or obstruct a federal investigation will result in serious criminal charges. I trust you understand the gravity of your situation, Mrs. Williams." Sheriff Miller lingered after the others left, his weathered hands working the brim of his hat with nervous energy. "Margaret, if there's something you need to tell me, now would be the time," he said quietly. "These federal boys aren't playing games, and I can't protect you if you're mixed up in something over my head." Margaret studied the man who'd been Tom's best friend, who'd taught her children to fish, who'd held her steady during the worst moments of her husband's funeral. Miller was a good man trapped in an impossible situation, forced to choose between federal pressure and local loyalty. She couldn't burden him with knowledge that might get him killed. "Dan, I appreciate your concern, but I honestly don't know what those men are looking for," Margaret said, which was technically true. She knew what they wanted, but not why it was worth killing for. "I'm just a retired teacher trying to live quietly on the mountain Tom loved." After Miller drove away with obvious reluctance, Margaret waited a full hour before releasing Benny from his hiding place. The cub emerged shaking with stress, immediately seeking comfort in her arms with desperate intensity. Margaret held him close, feeling his rapid heartbeat against her chest, understanding that their peaceful weeks of healing were over. That evening, Margaret made 2 crucial phone calls. The first was to the FBI field office in Billings, where she spoke with Agent Sarah Chen, carefully explaining that she had information about the Henderson murders that required immediate federal protection. Chen's response was professionally interested but not immediately helpful. She could visit within the week to take Margaret's statement, but couldn't provide protection without more specific threat assessment. The second call was to her daughter in Seattle, a conversation that required all of Margaret's acting skills to sound casual while conveying urgent subtext. "Sarah, honey, I was thinking about that photo album you wanted, the one with your father's army pictures. Maybe it's time I sent it to you, along with some other family things that should be somewhere safe." Sarah's response carried enough concern to suggest she'd caught the underlying message. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound different again." Not happy different like last time, but scared different. Margaret closed her eyes, memorizing the sound of her daughter's voice in case this was the last time she heard it. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about legacy things, you know. Making sure important memories are preserved." That night brought a break-in attempt that confirmed Margaret's worst fears. She woke to the sound of careful footsteps on her porch, professional movement designed to avoid creaking boards and squeaking hinges. Margaret slipped from bed with the silence born of decades sharing space with a light sleeping husband, Tom's shotgun heavy and reassuring in her arthritic hands. The intruder worked on her front door lock with tools and expertise that spoke of significant training, probably military or intelligence background. Margaret waited in the darkness of her living room, finger resting lightly on the shotgun's trigger, understanding that everything would change once she pulled it. Tom's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes doing right means doing hard, Maggie. Don't hesitate when it counts." When the door opened silently and a figure in dark clothing slipped inside, Margaret spoke from the shadows with deadly calm. "That's far enough. I have a shotgun pointed at your chest, and 40 years of marriage to a veteran taught me how to use it." The intruder froze, professional enough to recognize genuine threat in an elderly woman's steady voice. "Ma'am, I'm a federal agent investigating—" "You're a liar and a killer," Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying classroom authority that had once commanded respect from hundreds of children. "Real federal agents don't break into houses at midnight. Now back out that door very slowly, or I'll demonstrate why country women don't need 911 to handle varmints." The confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds, but it changed everything. The intruder retreated without argument, recognizing that Margaret Williams was no longer the harmless elderly woman they'd been monitoring. She'd declared war, and the stakes had just escalated beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. Margaret spent the rest of the night sitting in her rocking chair with the shotgun across her knees, Benny curled against her feet like a furry guardian angel. As dawn broke over the mountains she'd called home for 43 years, Margaret understood that the final battle was coming, and she'd have to be ready to sacrifice everything to protect the sweet souls sleeping trustingly at her feet. The final confrontation came with Tuesday's dawn, arriving like a summer storm, sudden, violent, and inescapable. Margaret woke to the sound of multiple vehicles surrounding her cabin, their engines cutting through the mountain silence with mechanical precision that spoke of coordinated assault rather than law enforcement procedure. Through her bedroom window she counted 4 black SUVs positioned to block every escape route, their occupants moving with military efficiency that made her blood freeze in her veins. Sterling stood in her front yard with the confidence of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey, no longer bothering with the pretense of federal authority. The men flanking him carried weapons openly now, their tactical gear marking them as private contractors rather than government agents. Margaret recognized the moment for what it was, the civilized world falling away to reveal the brutal reality beneath, where money and violence determined survival more than law or justice. "Mrs. Williams," Sterling called through her front door, his voice carrying mock courtesy that fooled no one. "We know you're harboring federal evidence. This is your final opportunity to surrender the animal and avoid serious consequences." Margaret clutched Tom's shotgun with hands that trembled from age and adrenaline, her arthritic fingers finding strength in the familiar weight of the weapon that had protected their family for decades. In the root cellar below, Benny waited in darkness, trusting her to keep him safe the way she'd once protected her own children from schoolyard bullies and teenage heartbreak. The parallel wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her entire adult life standing between innocents and those who would harm them. "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret replied, her teacher's voice carrying across the morning air with authority born of 40 years commanding attention in chaotic classrooms. "And I don't appreciate armed men trespassing on my property." Sterling's laugh held no humor, only the cold satisfaction of someone accustomed to winning through superior firepower. "We traced the Cubs' GPS collar to this location, old woman. Emma Henderson was stupid enough to think she could protect him by running, but technology doesn't lie. The animal is here, and we're going to retrieve our property." The word property hit Margaret like a physical blow, confirming her worst suspicions about Benny's origins and the Henderson family's fate. These men didn't see a traumatized baby who'd watched his human family murdered. They saw merchandise, valuable enough to kill for, expendable enough to torture for profit. The realization filled Margaret with rage that burned away her fear like morning fog before mountain sunshine. "That baby isn't property," Margaret called back, her voice rising with indignation that had once silenced rowdy assemblies and demanding parents. "He's a living creature who deserves protection, not exploitation." Sterling's response came in the form of action rather than words. He nodded to his men, who began advancing on the cabin with weapons raised, their movement coordinated and professional. Margaret understood that negotiation had ended, that whatever happened next would be decided by violence rather than reason. She'd taught children for 4 decades, but these men had forgotten every lesson about compassion and humanity their mothers had tried to instill. The first shot shattered Margaret's front window, sending glass fragments across the living room like deadly confetti. Margaret dove behind Tom's recliner, her body moving with reflexes honed by decades of playground supervision and emergency drills. The shotgun felt impossibly heavy in her hands as she realized she was about to use it against human beings, crossing a line she'd never imagined approaching in her quiet retirement. "Last chance, Mrs. Williams," Sterling shouted over the ringing in her ears. "Send out the bear and we'll make this quick." Margaret's response came from a place deeper than thought, drawing on protective instincts that had defined her identity since her children's birth. She rose from behind the chair like an avenging angel, Tom's shotgun steady in her grip despite her racing heart. "You want him? You come through me first." The shotgun's roar filled the cabin with thunder that seemed to shake the mountain itself. Sterling's men scattered for cover, their military training warring with surprise at meeting armed resistance from a 68-year-old retired teacher. Margaret had never shot at another human being, but 40 years of marriage to a veteran had taught her how to make her shots count when everything she loved hung in the balance. Benny's terrified whimpers echoed from the root cellar as gunfire erupted around the cabin, automatic weapons answering Margaret's defiance with overwhelming firepower that splintered wood and shattered dreams. Margaret crouched behind increasingly inadequate cover, reloading with hands that shook from arthritis and terror, understanding that her courage couldn't overcome superior numbers and military-grade equipment. As Sterling's men closed in for the final assault, Margaret pressed her back against the root cellar door and whispered a prayer for the innocent soul depending on her protection. She'd given everything she had, but it might not be enough to save the sweet baby who'd brought meaning back to her empty life. The gunfire stopped with shocking suddenness, replaced by shouting voices that carried authority Margaret hadn't heard in Sterling's mercenary operation. Through the shattered remains of her front window, she glimpsed movement that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Men in genuine federal windbreakers advancing with weapons drawn, their voices cutting through the mountain air with commands that sent Sterling's contractors scrambling for defensive positions. "Federal agents, drop your weapons! This is FBI!" Margaret remained crouched behind Tom's recliner, the shotgun trembling in her arthritic hands as she tried to process the sudden reversal of fortune. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, their rotors beating against the mountain air like mechanical thunder that promised salvation or destruction depending on whose side they were on. Margaret's teacher instincts, honed by decades of schoolyard emergencies, told her to stay down until the shooting stopped completely. Sterling's voice rose above the chaos, his professional composure finally cracking under pressure. "Stand down! We're conducting a legitimate federal operation under the Wildlife Protection Act." The response came from a woman's voice, sharp with authority and barely controlled anger. "Marcus Sterling, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and federal wildlife trafficking. Your fake credentials don't fool anyone anymore." Through her broken window, Margaret watched Sterling's face transform from confident predator to cornered animal as FBI agents surrounded his position with overwhelming force. His contractors, mercenaries hired for what they'd believed was simple intimidation, began lowering their weapons as they realized they'd been drawn into something far beyond their pay grade. Professional criminals understood the difference between easy money and federal prison sentences. "Agent Sarah Chen, FBI," came the woman's voice again, closer now and directed toward the cabin. "Mrs. Williams, are you injured? We're here to help." Margaret's laugh came out as a sob of relief that seemed to release months of accumulated terror and stress. The name Sarah Chen had become her lifeline during those desperate phone calls to the FBI field office, and hearing it now felt like divine intervention in a situation that had spiraled far beyond her ability to handle alone. She'd done everything she could to protect Benny, and help had finally arrived. "I'm here," Margaret called back, her voice cracking with emotion. "We're both okay." The next few minutes passed in a blur of organized chaos as FBI agents secured the scene with military precision. Margaret remained in the cabin as instructed, holding Benny close as he emerged from the root cellar, trembling but unharmed. The cub's dark eyes held intelligence beyond his months, and Margaret could see him processing the sounds of his enemies being arrested, understanding on some primal level that the nightmare might finally be ending. Agent Chen appeared in Margaret's doorway like an answer to prayer, her professional demeanor softened by genuine concern for the elderly woman who'd risked everything to protect federal evidence. She was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 40, with kind eyes that seemed to take in the destruction of the cabin and the courage it had required to survive the assault. "Mrs. Williams, I'm Agent Chen. We spoke on the phone," she said, holstering her weapon as she surveyed the damage Sterling's men had inflicted. "I'm sorry we couldn't get here sooner. Your call triggered a massive investigation that's been building for months." Margaret struggled to her feet, her body protesting the morning's violence with aches that reminded her of every one of her 68 years. "The cub," she said, gesturing toward Benny with protective instincts that hadn't diminished despite the arrival of legitimate help. "He's been through so much. He witnessed what happened to the Hendersons." Agent Chen knelt beside Benny with the careful movements of someone trained in handling traumatized witnesses, whether human or animal. The cub regarded her with wary intelligence, his body language suggesting recognition of authority without the terror Sterling's presence had triggered. Years of federal investigation had apparently given Chen insight into animal behavior that most law enforcement officers never developed. "This is Benjamin Henderson," Chen said softly, her voice carrying the weight of months of investigation. "Emma Henderson raised him from birth as part of her cooperation with our wildlife trafficking investigation. When she realized the danger, she tried to relocate him, but Sterling's people found them first." The full scope of the conspiracy unfolded as Chen explained the investigation that had been building around Sterling's operation for over 2 years. The trafficking ring had tentacles reaching into multiple states, involving exotic animal dealers, corrupt wildlife officials, and wealthy collectors willing to pay astronomical sums for illegal pets. Emma Henderson's decision to become an informant had threatened millions of dollars in annual revenue. Emma and David Henderson were murdered because they refused to sell Benjamin to a private collector in Asia, Chen continued, her professional composure wavering as she described the brutality that had orphaned the cub. Sterling executed them personally, but Benjamin escaped into the woods before they could capture him. Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she learned the full scope of Benny's trauma and the courage his human parents had shown in protecting him. The mother bear who'd delivered him to her doorstep had been part of a larger network of wild animals that Emma had befriended during her rehabilitation work, creating an underground railroad that had saved Benjamin's life through interspecies cooperation that defied conventional understanding. The mother bear was one of Emma's success stories, Chen explained, noting Margaret's wonder at the delivery system that had brought Benny to safety. Emma had rehabilitated her after a car accident 3 years ago. Bears have incredible memories and emotional intelligence. She understood that Benjamin needed human protection and brought him to the only person in the area who lived alone and might help. As Sterling and his contractors were loaded into federal transport vehicles, Margaret watched through her broken window with satisfaction that felt like justice finally served. The man who terrorized her, murdered the Hendersons, and threatened Benny's life would spend the rest of his days in federal prison, his trafficking network dismantled by the investigation his own greed had triggered. "What happens to Benjamin now?" Margaret asked, the question that had been forming in her heart since the moment she'd first held the orphaned cub. 2 months of love and healing had created bonds that felt as strong as any she'd formed with her own children, and the thought of losing him now seemed unbearable. Agent Chen's smile carried hope that made Margaret's heart soar with possibility. "That depends on several factors, Mrs. Williams. Federal law requires special licensing for wildlife rehabilitation, but your success with Benjamin's recovery and the unique circumstances of the case suggest there might be options we can explore." Margaret looked down at Benny, who had fallen asleep against her leg with the trust of a child who'd found safety after unimaginable trauma. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that their story might have a happy ending, that love and courage might triumph over greed and violence in ways that restored her faith in justice. 6 months after the FBI raid that shattered her quiet retirement and nearly cost both their lives, Margaret Williams stood in her rebuilt kitchen watching Benny play in the autumn sunshine that streamed through new windows. The bullet holes had been repaired, the splintered wood replaced, but the real healing had taken place in the bond between a lonely widow and an orphaned bear who'd found family in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. The legal proceedings had taken months to resolve, with federal judges, wildlife experts, and congressional representatives all weighing in on the unprecedented case of a civilian who'd risked her life to protect a key witness in a federal trafficking investigation. Margaret's courage during Sterling's assault had captured national attention, transforming her from an invisible retired teacher into a symbol of ordinary Americans standing up to extraordinary evil. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, with news crews camping outside her cabin and reporters calling at all hours seeking interviews about the Bear Whisperer of Montana. Margaret had initially refused all requests, protecting both her privacy and Benny's recovery from the trauma of his early months. But as the story spread across social media and captured hearts nationwide, she'd begun to understand the power of their narrative to inspire change. Judge Patricia Morrison's ruling had been historic, establishing legal precedent for civilian wildlife protection under extraordinary circumstances. Mrs. Williams demonstrated remarkable courage in protecting federal evidence while law enforcement resources were compromised, the judge had stated during the final hearing. Her actions directly contributed to the successful prosecution of a major criminal enterprise and deserve recognition rather than punishment. The special custody arrangement granted Margaret legal guardianship of Benny under a federal wildlife rehabilitation license that made her cabin an official sanctuary for orphaned bear cubs. Government funding supported the transformation of her property into a model facility that could serve as a template for similar programs nationwide. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that her retirement savings had been stretched to breaking before Benny's arrival, and now federal grants ensured her financial security for life. Sarah arrived from Seattle for her first visit since the media storm had transformed her mother from forgotten widow into national celebrity. Margaret watched through the kitchen window as her daughter met Benny for the first time, laughing with delight as the young bear demonstrated his intelligence by opening the gate to his exercise yard and padding over to investigate the newcomer with gentle curiosity. "Mom, he's incredible," Sarah said as she entered the kitchen with Benny following behind like an oversized puppy. "I mean, I've seen the videos online, but meeting him in person, he's like a furry little person, isn't he?" Margaret smiled as Benny settled beside her chair, his massive paw resting on her foot in a gesture of affection that had become their daily ritual. At 14 months old, he now weighed nearly 200 pounds, but his gentle nature and obvious intelligence had made him a perfect ambassador for wildlife protection causes that Margaret had never imagined championing. "He saved me as much as I saved him," Margaret replied, stroking Benny's thick autumn coat. "I was just existing before he came along, waiting to die like furniture in an empty house. Now I have purpose again, something that matters beyond my own loneliness." Michael arrived the next day with his twin boys, 8-year-old Christopher and Matthew, who'd been begging to meet their famous grandmother and her bear since the story broke nationwide. Margaret watched her grandsons' faces light up with wonder as Benny demonstrated his ability to fetch specific objects, open doors, and even help with simple household tasks that showcased the remarkable intelligence Emma Henderson had nurtured before her murder. "Grandma Maggie, can Benny really understand what you're saying?" Christopher asked, his young mind struggling to process the reality of interspecies communication that seemed to border on magical. "Watch this," Margaret said, turning to Benny with the same patient tone she'd once used with difficult students. "Benjamin, would you please bring me my reading glasses from the table?" Benny padded across the room, carefully lifted Margaret's glasses in his teeth, and returned to place them gently in her outstretched hand. The boys erupted in delighted applause while their father shook his head in amazement at the bond his mother had formed with a creature that defied every assumption about wild animal behavior. The transformation in Margaret herself was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. The anxious, invisible widow who'd been contemplating assisted living had become a confident advocate for wildlife protection who spoke at universities, testified before congressional committees, and consulted with animal behaviorists studying interspecies emotional bonds. Her memoir, Finding Family in the Wild, had become a bestseller whose proceeds funded bear rehabilitation programs across North America. "I spent 40 years teaching children, but Benny taught me things about love and courage that I never learned in any classroom," Margaret told the documentary crew that arrived to film their daily routine. "He showed me that family isn't always about blood relationships. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them most." The educational impact of their partnership had exceeded everyone's expectations. Margaret's presentations at schools and wildlife centers had inspired a new generation of conservation advocates who understood that protecting animals meant protecting the emotional connections that make life meaningful. Benny's gentle interactions with children had demolished stereotypes about dangerous wild animals while teaching respect for creatures that deserved protection rather than exploitation. The Silver Bear Brigade, Margaret's volunteer program for elderly wildlife caretakers, had trained 47 seniors in basic bear rehabilitation during its first year of operation. The program's success had caught the attention of federal agencies seeking innovative approaches to wildlife protection that utilized the wisdom and dedication of older Americans who'd been written off by a youth-obsessed society. These volunteers bring patience and empathy that you can't teach in any training manual, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the wildlife veterinarian who'd overseen Benny's medical care since his rescue. They understand that healing requires time and consistency, qualities that our fast-paced world has largely forgotten. The ripple effects of Margaret and Benny's story had extended far beyond wildlife protection into broader conversations about aging, purpose, and the connections that give life meaning. Senior centers across the country had established animal therapy programs modeled on their relationship, recognizing that caring for other creatures could provide the sense of worth that many elderly Americans had lost along with their professional identities. Margaret's evening routine with Benny had become a meditation on the unexpected gifts that emerge from tragedy when hearts remain open to possibility. As she read aloud from the children's books that Benny seemed to enjoy, his favorite was still Goldilocks and the Three Bears, which never failed to make Margaret smile. She reflected on the journey that had brought them together through violence and loss to something resembling peace. "You know what the best part is?" Margaret said to the documentary cameras during their final interview, Benny sleeping peacefully beside her chair as autumn light painted the rebuilt cabin in shades of gold and amber. "I thought my teaching days were over when I retired, but Benny reminded me that the most important lessons aren't found in textbooks. They're found in showing up for each other when the world gets scary and dark." The closing shot of the documentary showed Margaret and Benny in their morning routine, she reading the newspaper aloud while he brought her coffee cup and heart medication with the careful precision of a devoted grandson. It was an image that captured hearts worldwide because it represented something everyone craved: the possibility that love could triumph over loneliness, that courage could overcome fear, and that sometimes the family you need most arrives in the most unexpected package. As winter approached their second year together, Margaret Williams knew she'd found her true calling in the twilight of her life. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving, teaching, and making a difference that would outlast her mortal years. Sometimes God sends angels with fur instead of feathers, and wise women simply say thank you while trying to be worthy of the blessing. Margaret had learned that it's never too late to discover that your most important work might still lie ahead, waiting patiently for you to be brave enough to embrace it. At 68, Margaret Williams thought her story was over. Another forgotten widow counting down lonely days in an empty house where even her own children rarely called. Sound familiar? Maybe you've set 2 plates for dinner out of habit, then quietly put one back. Maybe you've wondered if anyone would even notice if you disappeared tomorrow. Margaret felt that invisible ache too, until a terrified bear cub taught her the most beautiful truth. It's never too late to discover your most important chapter is still unwritten. When that baby arrived at her doorstep, broken and needing someone to believe he mattered, Margaret found what she'd been missing: purpose that made her heart race with excitement instead of anxiety. Medication. She went from feeling like a burden her children wanted to warehouse in assisted living to becoming a national hero whose courage saved lives and inspired legislation. The woman who thought she had nothing left to give became a teacher again, showing America that our seniors aren't problems to solve, but wisdom to treasure. Your story isn't over either. Somewhere, someone needs exactly what your heart has to offer, if you're brave enough to say yes when love knocks unexpectedly. Share your thoughts. What unexpected opportunity knocked on your door that you almost ignored? When did you last feel truly needed by someone who wasn't family?